Welcome to this new interview in the framework of the INCrEAsE European project. As I said, the interview is realized in the framework of the European project entitled after Intercultural Competencies for Adult Educators with the acronym INCrEAsE. The project is funded by the European Commission in the framework of the Erasmus Plus program, Strategic Partnership for Adult Education. The project aims to develop intercultural communication of adult educators working in formal and non-formal educational settings in order to help them to overcome the challenges arising from their everyday work with multicultural and multilingual learners population. So the focus of the project is addressed to adult educators, and one of them accepted to be the sacrificial victim of this interview. So first of all, I would like to thank Jessica Colombo for her involvement in the project and in this interview. I will leave immediately the floor to Jessica in order to present herself with a specific focus on her work as adult educator, and if possible to know which types of multicultural learners you got in contact with. Please, Jessica.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Pixel, for this opportunity. It's an honor to join you today. I work as a freelancer. I'm a freelancer adult educator. I have almost 10 years of experience in training in non-formal environments mostly. I have been working with many different actors and multicultural learners, actually. My main involvement has been with international projects funded by the European Commission, the World Bank, but also by UN agencies like WFP, the World Food Programme, FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNFPA, but also I've been called from the Center of Excellence for Stability Policy Units, whose acronym is COESPU, which is a non-formal institute for training high-ranking police officers coming from all over the world to join the UN peace forces. This is my main assignment with the multicultural learners, because as you can imagine, I have been dealing with so many different people coming from all over the world, mostly actually from the African countries, Asian countries, and Latin American countries, because these are the areas of the world which need most training on international topics addressing, for example, human rights, gender topics, gender issues in humanitarian settings. So I have been a trainer for many years in this environment, focusing mainly on gender aspects, protection from gender-based violence in humanitarian context, both in conflict settings and disaster-related settings, protection of human rights, and all the the management of humanitarian principles when dealing in humanitarian settings. Of course, it's been a very challenging experience in dealing with so many different people in one room, coming from very different part of the world, with different language skills, different formal skills, meaning competencies developed in their education, but also with so many different concepts related to cultural, to their cultural background, right? Because when we speak about, for example, gender issues, well, this is a very culturally related topic. So it's very important to have a multicultural approach when dealing with this kind of topics. Do you want me to go ahead freely?
I will go on with the second question. Anyway, I was asked to involve in this project adult educators with experience dealing with multicultural issues. And I have to admit that on the basis of what you said, I did the best choice in asking you to getting involved in this project, in this interview. So I would like to focus on your experience, on the basis of your experience dealing with multicultural learners. You are free to speak about any problem that you faced, or successful experiences, or best practice to be shared with other adult educators, or you can make reference to each of them. So problems, successful experiences, and best practice.
Okay, problems first, because it's always the easiest starting point, right? Of course, the problems were many, because of what I already said, because of the cultural background. You know, we always start from our own point of view. It's a natural condition. It's you know, we have a psychologically comfort zone we live in, and we start from that point. When you deal with people coming from so many different countries with so many different cultural concepts, it's very uncomfortable. You have to step out of your comfort zone and adapt to their view, and try to actively listen to them in order to be a successful educator, right? Because you cannot say that these concepts are very easy to pass on. You have to understand first what is the understanding that the other people have of these very how can I say, very challenging topics. So the first problem was to actually listen carefully to them. You cannot jump off with a very static point of view, right? You have to open up and first listen to what they have to say to you, and then you can build on what they are saying and build on their experiences, and you have to adapt. Also, sometimes you have to improvise, right? You have like a skeleton there, you have guidelines, but then you have to adapt very quickly based on the responses you get from, for example, a first round of presentation, a first round of experience, of sharing experiences. So, for example, when I spoke with these high-ranking police officers who have been dealing with so many different situations in very difficult settings, because we are speaking about Darfur, Democratic Republic of Congo, or all the Asian countries impacted by the tsunami back in 2004. Then you realize that they have experienced so many different situations that have shaped their point of view. So their reality is what they have lived in that context. So when you speak about, for example, gender-based violence, is what they have lived there, and that's their only experience. And in order to make them understand all the theoretical point of view of these kind of topics, it's very useful to start from the direct experience they have, and not only from what they have lived, but also their understanding coming from their own personal cultural background. Because when you have, for example, a Filipino acting in Darfur, then you have a clash of cultures, right? Because of, well, their the language first, but also religion, their expectations, their roles that they want to perform. These are all based on their cultural background. So the main problem is actually to really adapt and to be flexible enough to harness on all those experiences. But this is also at the same time a best practice, right? So once you overcome this problem of being adaptable, being an active listener, being open to what comes from the audience, from the learners actually, then it's always a success, because you are then able to build on what they give you. And so your teaching experience is based on something that they actually understand.
Okay, thanks for this different way to see all the problems, because when problems become some strengths to be used, it is the best way to deal with multicultural assets. And next one is not exactly a question, is much more a game I just had in my mind. So just making reference to what you said and some of the keywords that you mentioned during these first two questions. You have been speaking about challenge, active listening, thinking out of or getting out of the comfort zone, ability to adapt. And if you are asked to mention other keywords that come to your mind, if you have to refer to multicultural issues, what other keywords can you add to those which are already listed above?
Openness, for sure, but also body language. The use of body language is always a very good point when you deal with multicultural learners or multicultural activities. That's also actually something that I used to do always in my trainings, to have a smaller or a bigger space, actually focusing on body language, because this is something that it's overlooked sometimes, right? But signs, ways of standing or sitting give messages, but these messages can be either well received or misinterpreted based on the body language, which is very specific of cultures. In some cultures, one sign can mean something, and for another culture, it can be, I don't know, misinterpreted or even offensive, right? So the body language is a key word or a key concept that is, for me, very relevant in the environment of multicultural activities.
Okay, and on the basis of this, some of the keywords that you mentioned, I think they are much part of our background and our nature, and some others can be increased by training, by studying in order to become an adult educator dealing with multicultural issues. So with reference to your experience, do you think that you are doing this kind of job because of your nature, or because you have been following some training in order to be adult educator, or a mixture of both the things?
I think it's a mixture, at least for me, in my experience. So I have my personal experiences in my life. I started very young. When I was 17, I jumped on an airplane with a grant I received, and I flew to the Dominican Republic. I spent there 1 year in a completely different cultural environment, and this gave me an open-mindedness that very few young people have, right? Then I traveled a lot. I was always interested in other cultures. I actually had my master's degree in development studies, and my first bachelor degree was in intercultural communication. So it was an interest of mine, right? But then, of course, it's always a mixture of your own personal interests, in my opinion. But of course, there are instruments that give you a deeper understanding of what multicultural means, what multicultural teaching or learning can mean. And of course, the experience gives you a lot of insight And the more you deal with multicultural learning environments, the more you are able to deal with multicultural learners.
So there are some skills which can be trained, or better, there are some skills which can be developed thanks to the experience that you do in your daily routine.
Yes, because I do think so. I mean, of course, your let's say your expertise and as a multicultural trainer is based on studies and on, of course, let's say more formal training competencies. But then, of course, it's not a very static component of the training. So dealing with multicultural people is, to me, is enhanced by the way the experience you gain in dealing with them. The more you deal with them, with multicultural environments, the more you learn how to actually be successful in this kind of experiences.
Okay, thanks for this. And in the interviews that I already did, another keyword which has been mentioned was responsibility. Do you think that there is a difference in terms of responsibility for adult educators dealing with multicultural learners and adult educators dealing with a unique cultural model, as long as it is still possible to speak about a unique cultural model?
I don't understand exactly the reference to responsibility. What do you mean about responsibility?
Adult educators should have they have a big responsibility. And according to what emerged in previous interviews, that their responsibility is much higher than the responsibility for those adult educators just dealing with, let's say, one cultural model or homogeneous classrooms. Is there a different responsibility?
I think that the main responsibility of multicultural educators is to ensure that the message, the educating message you want to pass on to your educational audience is given properly, despite the different the cultural differences of the education of the learners, right? So that's the main responsibility, being able to teach to educate people despite the different cultural background they have. And in this sense, you have to ensure that you build a common ground before with your learning audience, and be sure that despite the differences, they get the message you want to give them.
Yeah, the question was born because, in particular in Italy, there is this kind of perception according to which those dealing with multicultural issues, working with people coming from other parts of the world, the south of the world, they do a great job, but on the same time, some of them, they feel like being like God on earth, and this is the main aspect which is criticized by those who are against multicultural issues. This idea of, okay, I'm dealing with multicultural learners with multicultural issues, I feel more important than any other teacher or any other educator. And sometimes, at least in the common discussion in Italy, this aspect is criticized by those who are completely against the presence of multicultural issues or multicultural people in our country. Just to explain the reason why of the question, because it is an aspect which was underlined by other adult educators. The responsibility is being educator. It doesn't matter if you are dealing with people coming from the same context or people coming from different contexts. Maybe the difficulties maybe are higher, and there are more skills which can enter and that you have to use. For example, I totally agree with the ability to adapt, which is something which was also underlined by other educators. We have been speaking about adult educators, and the focus of this interview is on adult educators. But yesterday I had an interesting interview with an adult learner, and when I asked him about the experience of being a learner in multicultural in a multicultural context. We are speaking about a guy coming from Africa and studying in Italy and in Germany. He said, just a suggestion for other adult learners, be prepared to a cultural shock. Do you feel that adult educators live this kind of experience, this experience of a cultural shock while dealing with people coming from all over the world?
In part, I would not call it a shock. I was let's say, a multicultural learner myself when I had my master experience, for example, in the Netherlands. I was completely shocked. The first 10 days, I called back home and said, I want to come home. I won't do it here because I cannot do it here. So because this was because I think when you are a learner, you have this sense that you have to prove something, that you have to, you have to do it and you have to make it right to the end. So you have you think you have others, especially the educators, have expectations from you, and this is sometimes one of the aspects that causes the shock, right? Besides of course the differences and so on. When you are an adult educator, it's actually a good point, to keep in mind about this possibility of having a cultural shock in your audience. So you can try to ease that shock, because it's not just a difference in cultures, it's also a difference in methodologies, for example, a difference in dealing, for example, the difference in how you have relationships between the educator and the learner in different contexts. So if you move in from one context to the other, you have different relationships, and this can cause the shock. But in the case of adult educators, no, I wouldn't speak about a cultural shock. Sometimes, yes, you have difficulties in making yourself understandable to others, but I wouldn't call it a shock. It's just an obstacle sometimes.
Okay. Last question. I perfectly know that I'm not following the, the list of questions that I provided you with.
No problem. I tried to prepare. They are there, but I'm not even looking at my,
Okay, because according to the input that I receive, it's kind of natural to be interested in some aspects rather than others. So I promise it is the last question, but it is, once again, it is much more a game, as I'm a lot in the fairy tale mood. Let's think you are in front of a mirror, and on the other side of the mirror there is you at the age of 17, on your flights, on your first experience, with your ambitions, with your fears, with your doubts. What would you say to yourself to convince that this is the right way, this is your path, and this is your job? In other words, which is the recommendation you would give to adult educators, but with a specific focus on your experience? What would you suggest? How would you convince you at the age of 17?
To become an adult educator in multicultural environments?
Yes, or to follow this kind of path, which is anyway connected with multiculturalism.
Yes. Well, to me, multiculturalism has always been an opportunity. Because if you always live in your little corner of the world, you lose a lot of opportunities to discover how people live differently, how they can teach you something. Because anytime you deal with somebody different from you, it can also be in your own cultural context, but it has a bigger impact if you go in a different context. You have the opportunity to learn even before teaching or educating other people on specific topics. You have the opportunity to learn different ways of looking at things, different ways of dealing with things, different perspectives, point of view, and it's always an enriching experience. So this is also something that I always try to teach to, for example, my little daughter or my older daughter. Always to be prepared to welcome things that are different from you, because you can like or not like them, which is a very simplistic way of looking at things, but it will give you something that it will remain there, and it's always a little brick in your life that makes you a better person. And if you are a better person, then you can also be a better person in the world and make your contribution. This is probably a very idealistic way of looking at things, but this is something that moved me back then and keeps me moving right now.
And I totally agree. And if I can add something, the sooner you do this kind of, you learn this lesson that you can learn just a little brick from each experience, the sooner you understand this and the easier it is then. Because if you do this kind of experience when you are already 30, 35, you can learn a lot anyway. But if you start sooner, it will be really, really easy, and you can really enrich yourself and the person you live with. So I think your daughters are quite lucky. Thanks a lot for your availability, for these really interesting inputs, and also for replying to tricky questions, but that was my fault. And thanks again.
It was very nice to speak with you today.